All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bryan, Tramont, Managing Partner of Wilkinson, Barker, Knauer, and Chair of the Federalist Society Telecom and Media Practice Group. I'd like to welcome you to our panel this afternoon entitled The Future of the Internet and American Leadership. We have a couple of addresses followed by a panel discussion this afternoon with a great lineup, so I'm really pleased that we were able to attract such a great group of speakers and appreciate all of you joining us this afternoon. We're going to be kicked off with a discussion, or a speech rather, by Commissioner Brendan Carr, a commissioner on the Federal Communications Commission. He was nominated and confirmed unanimously by the United States Senate to that post in August of 2017. Prior to that, he served as the FCC's general counsel. And before that, he was the lead advisor to FCC Commissioner Ajit Pai on wireless public safety international issues. Prior to that, he served in the Office of General Counsel and practiced as an attorney at Wiley Ryan. He was also a law clerk on the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals and is a graduate of the Catholic University School of Law and Georgetown University undergrad. Commissioner Carr has been a tremendous leader in his short time at the Commission, particularly on infrastructure issues and issues related to 5G. So we're particularly pleased that he could be here today to discuss American leadership in this space. With that, Commissioner Carr.
Well, thanks, Bryan, for that kind introduction. When you read the bio that way, it makes it sound like I have a difficulty holding out a job, so maybe I can stay put in this one for a little while. One thing you did neglect to mention is your responsibility for all of this that's up here today. When I was a law student at Catholic, their telecom program, Bryan was a professor of mine and helped get me interested in work at the FCC, picked up the phone and got me my first internships at the Commission with then Commissioner Abernathy, and then on the House Telecom Subcommittee, so played an important role in getting the career sort of off and running. So thank you for that. It's great to be here today. Thursday, I'll actually be down in Richmond at another FedSoc local chapter event, giving some similar remarks to these. So this will help me really polish my remarks. I'll be ready to go when I get back down to Richmond. This is a great topic to speak about the future of the Internet, American leadership in this space. This is a crowd that probably doesn't need much reminding about how the Internet really is the greatest private sector innovation, I think, in history. There was a lot of government involvement early on, but when the Internet really took off, when it was privatized and we had the private investment, the private capital, the private innovation that led it to what it was. And for the first 20 or so years of the Internet's history, it flourished under an extremely light touch approach. And this wasn't an accident. In the 1996 Act, Congress specifically, on a bipartisan basis, determined that the Internet should be allowed to flourish unfettered by state and local regulation. And in hindsight, that was truly a remarkable decision. Congress didn't know how the Internet was going to develop, where it was going to go. And so instead of preemptively regulating or piling regulations on it, they decided to step back. Fast forward a couple years from there to 2015, we saw $1.6 trillion in private sector investment in constructing, deploying, and maintaining networks. The Internet in the U.S. truly became the envy of the world. Mark Cuban remarked back in 2015 that there's no greater platform in the world to start a business than the Internet in the United States. Small companies grew from dorm rooms to garages to corporate behemoth. Consumers were protected. It literally changed the way we live and learn. Tremendous amount of benefits. In 2015, however, the FCC decided on a party line vote to go an entirely different direction. It decided to apply what's known as Title II regulatory framework to the Internet. This was an unprecedented decision. Title II harkens back to the 1930s era monopoly regulations. The idea is to regulate scarcity. The result is that you regulate to scarcity. The largest Internet providers in the country, the Verizons, the AT&Ts, the Comcasts, our records show that that 2015 decision had a negative impact on their investments and on their deployments. But those same companies also have an army of regulatory lawyers that can work through the immense requirements that generally come from this broad Title II framework. There are thousands of other broadband providers out there, most of which, because there's thousands of them, you probably can't name. And they're the ones that are trying to serve in rural parts of the country, to give you the first broadband connection to a community, or the first competitive offering to the community. Those smaller ones were the ones that were hit particularly hard by the FCC's decision to apply this Title II framework to the internet. So we had that experiment for 2 years. We saw investment declining in this space. We saw new deployments being put on hold. We saw innovative new service offerings being put on the shelf. It was a point in time in which I was worried about America's leadership in the internet space. But thankfully, at the end of last year, the FCC reversed that 2015 decision. We went back to the pre-2015 framework of a light-touch regulatory approach to the internet. This is going to benefit consumers and innovators and entrepreneurs alike. And there's a lot of discussion around the FCC's decision. Most of what we do, rightly so, at the Commission is below the headlines and, in fact, is nowhere to be found in any newspaper. But our decision on net neutrality on Title II is one that for a little while was front page news. When that happens, there is a lot of misinformation out there. I think if you were to read the accounts, it suggested that it was the end of the internet, or we were going to unleash some Mad Max version of the internet where ISPs were free to block or throttle or prioritize traffic over your traffic. The truth, obviously, is somewhere else. I think some of that was a symptom of our larger political environment right now, where everything is characterized as an existential threat or crisis. Here's the reality. Again, we went back to the same tried and true 2015 regime in which consumers were protected. This wasn't actually an approach where we moved and relied entirely or exclusively on market forces, though I think there's a strong case to be made that in this area where we are seeing a lot of competition, reliance on market forces would have been enough. But instead, we put a number of consumer protections in place. First of all, by reversing that Title II decision, we restored the authority of the Federal Trade Commission. One quirk in the FCC's 2015 decision, when they classified broadband internet access service as a utility, was that it stripped the Federal Trade Commission, which is our country's premier consumer protection agency, of 100% of its authority to protect consumers when it comes to ISPs. So by reversing that 2015 decision, we've now restored the authority of the Federal Trade Commission. They can take a number of consumer protection steps to protect consumers with respect to ISPs. Second is antitrust law. So take Section 1 of the Sherman Act, for instance, which renders anti-competitive agreements per se unlawful. So if an ISP were going forward to engage in an agreement to act non-neutrally, to unfairly block or to discriminate or to prioritize conduct, that would be per se under Section 1 of the Sherman Act. Similarly, under Section 2 of the Sherman Act, it makes it illegal for a vertically integrated ISP to discriminate against an unaffiliated provider. So if you're a vertically integrated ISP, if you have a content portion of your business, you could not, under Section 2 of the Sherman Act, discriminate against an unaffiliated content provider to favor your content over that. And we also have state consumer protection laws that would apply. Fourth and finally is online data privacy and security protections. Again, when the Commission moved in 2015, it created essentially a donut hole where the FTC had strong privacy protections in place. Reclassifying broadband as an internet service provider stripped those privacy protections of all broadband consumers. Now, there was still a statutory provision in the Communications Act that would apply, and then the FCC later tried to fill the donut hole with rules that were ultimately reversed by a decision from Congress using the Congressional Review Act. So by reversing the Title II decision, we again restored consumers' privacy protections that had been in place with the Federal Trade Commission. So I think that the future now is extremely bright. Again, we have gone back to the same tried and true regime that protected consumers, and we're doing away with a heavy-handed Title II approach to the internet, which the record of the Commission, and based on my judgment, was deterring investment, deterring innovation. There's no doubt that there's plenty of room for reasonable minds to disagree about this approach, to read our record differently, to believe that Title II was the right approach. But having looked at it myself, I think that our own experience before 2015 shows us that this was the right way to go. But in a lot of ways, this entire debate about net neutrality in Title II, in my view, is sort of a backward-looking debate. When you get outside of D.C. and you talk to consumers, to the extent that they care about broadband, which many, many do, what they care about is getting better and faster and cheaper broadband. And on that score, the future is actually pretty interesting. So one thing that we're looking forward to is what's known as 5G, which is the next generation of wireless service. A lot of consumers right now have 4G service. 5G is going to be faster. It's going to have what's known as lower latency. It's essentially going to be the new wireless technology that's going to enable all of those cutting-edge innovations you're hearing about now to actually become a reality, whether it's connected cars or remote surgery or industrial Internet of Things. But there was a big challenge that we were facing at the Commission when we look at getting 5G across the finish line. And that was that our regulatory frameworks were geared to legacy types of deployment. Going forward for 5G or for advanced 4G, upwards of 80% of new cell site deployments are going to be what are known as small cells. So these are cells the size of a pizza box or a backpack. For 4G in prior generations, the majority were those tall 100-foot, 200-foot towers. So unfortunately, our regulatory regime was assuming that every new cell site that you were deploying, whether it's this backpack-sized small cell, had to go through the same regulatory process as a 100-foot, 200-foot tower. That was a bottleneck that was potentially holding us back from 5G, from getting more broadband to more Americans. So a couple months ago at the Commission, we took a step to update and modernize our rules. One thing that we did was we looked at the federal approach that governed federal review in terms of historic review and environmental review. And we did a couple things. One was that for small cells, we excluded those deployments from the federal historic and environmental review procedures completely. This was not an area where we viewed that regulatory incrementalism was going to cut it. We need to make sure that we're leaning forward so we're going to get more 5G deployed faster and quicker to more Americans. So we excluded small cells from that federal historic and environmental review. The economics that we've seen has shown that's going to make a tremendous difference in terms of deployment. Right now, upwards of 30% of the total cost of deploying a small cell was caught up in these federal historic and environmental reviews. Last year, providers spent $36 million complying with this federal historic and environmental review procedures for these small cells. If that review was producing results in some significant number of cases, then maybe that's worth it. Maybe those benefits are worth the cost. But what we found was that in all but 0.33% of cases, those reviews weren't resulting in any changes or augmentation of a deployment. That's millions of dollars in federal process that could have been used to go towards deployment that were just going into federal regulatory red tape. So we eliminated it entirely. That was $36 million last year. As we see 5G starting to increase, to spike, it was estimated that this year those costs were going to rise to $241 million. And so when you project out over the course of 5G deployment, excluding small cells from that federal regulatory red tape is expected to save us $1.6 billion in regulatory costs. That money can then be used for 57,000 new cell site deployments. It'll create 17,000 jobs just cutting that federal regulatory red tape. That's going to flip the business case for communities that were uneconomical for the private sector to serve with 5G, with advanced wireless service, to being economical. And I've seen it. I took a road trip through the Shenandoah Valley, the western part of Virginia, which you all know because we're pretty close to that. That line works better when you're not in this area. And I saw a small cell that's being deployed in a rural high school in a small town right there, not far from Front Royal. And I talked to the small wireless provider that's serving there. A lot of people here haven't heard of it. But they said that by streamlining regulatory review, they can deploy something like 15 additional cell sites in the Shenandoah Valley. And that may not sound like a big deal. We need thousands of cell sites to get 5G deployed, but that can make a big difference in that rural community. It can get them their first broadband. I went to Baltimore, to East Baltimore, a neighborhood that's really being revitalized, and it's on the upswing. And they're getting we saw a new small cell that was being deployed. That could be the only on-ramp to the internet for communities in that area. These are the stories that we need to see replicated around the country. Last week I was in rural parts of Nevada. Went to a small town called Beatty, population 1,010. They had a medical clinic there that was about to shut down, but they got a new high-speed wireless connection. They were able to keep it open. They did so. They had a nurse. Her name was Teresa. She was able to stay there and work 9 to 5. And then you can connect virtually through this broadband connection to a doctor that works in a much larger town. I went there. I saw it. It's amazing. I mean, you literally go with a broadband connection from having health care for this community or not. It makes the difference. Went to the local high school, learned about the online learning opportunities that kids are getting from their new broadband connections. So all of this is to say that this is real. Cutting regulatory red tape truly does deliver results. It truly does flip communities from getting them online opportunity from where they don't. That's why I think this Title II debate is backward looking. Congress is looking at this issue. I fully support and would welcome Congress stepping in and definitively addressing net neutrality one way or the other. But in the meantime, there's work for us to continue to do at the Commission. And I gave a speech a couple years ago in Europe, and I used a line from Margaret Thatcher back then. And I think it's apropos of where we've gone and now where we are on internet regulation. And she said that you can always trust Americans to do the right thing once they've tried all other options. And I think the heavy-handed Title II approach to the internet was tried. It didn't work. I'm really glad that the Federal Communications Commission was able to vote to restore a light touch approach to the internet. It's going to benefit consumers. And going forward, we have continued work to do with removing regulatory barriers so we can get more broadband out there to more Americans. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. And I know Commissioner Carr has agreed to take a few questions from our audience. So if folks would have any questions? If not, of course, I can come up with more than a few.
Title II, Title III.
Or we can go back to our law school days, and I can just call on people in the back row. Perhaps we should talk a little bit about spectrum. So we talked about infrastructure. Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah, sorry, Brooks. Go ahead.
Sorry, Bryan.
Nice try there.
Yeah.
I'll just throw one out, a little wacky, but maybe a little wonky for this group. But what do you see ATSC 3.0 having a role going forward in terms of complementary to 5G?
So we do have a microphone, and we'll use it going forward. But Brooks's question was about the role of ATSC 3 and how it fits into this overall equation.
So we talked about 5G, which is the next generation of wireless service. ATSC 3.0 is what we refer to as next-gen TV. It's the next generation broadcast standard. It's expected also to bring some interesting innovations to consumers. Higher definition service, better emergency alerts, all kinds of additional functionalities that broadcasters could bring to consumers. I'm personally very excited about it. The broadcast industry needed to come to the FCC and get approval to deploy that new technology, and we were able to vote in favor of doing that. And we'll see where the technology goes, but I think the key is to let industry, whether it's the wireless sector or the broadcasting sector, continue to innovate, and let's see where consumers can benefit from that.
So we have another question.
Hi, I'm Diane Katz with the Heritage Foundation. It's great that the FCC, has overturned the order.
Yeah,
the
exactly.
internet order, and but the regulatory threat isn't going away. Last week we heard Zuckerberg basically invite Congress to regulate, and a number of other major players in the online space are doing the same thing. So I just wanted your take on the regulation from that end.
Yeah. A couple thoughts. So the most controversial in my mind, from my perspective, aspect of this net neutrality debate is what I refer to as this Title II regime. So what the FCC did in 2015 is they reclassified broadband under this old, reticulated, these are all these negative words, Title II framework, and then it hung its net neutrality rules off of that new Title II regime. So in a lot of ways, it's two different debates. What's sort of the legal classification of broadband, and what are the rules that should apply? In large measure, I think there's very little controversy, relatively little controversy, about what rules of the road should be. And that's because a lot of these practices are practices that consumers have long expected and that broadband providers meet because consumers want it. So I think there's some debate, but relatively little debate about what those rules should look like. The bigger debate has been about Title II. So the extent that Congress decides to step in, potentially in an effort to prevent the ping-ponging back and forth between when the executive branch switches over, I'm open to Congress stepping in because I think the rules of the road in many respects aren't that controversial.
Other question? There we go.
Just following up on that, I know this is outside.
Do you mind identify yourself first?
Just Mark Epstein, I'm on myself. Excellent.
Uniquely.
There's been a lot of concern by conservatives about censorship, primarily coming from the edge providers, which came up at the hearings last week. And so I know this is outside of the FCC's jurisdiction, but do you believe that some of the rules that apply to ISPs should also apply to the edge?
Yeah. So one point this highlights is that 2015 decision, again, sort of split the internet ecosystem. It left edge providers, the Facebooks, Googles, subject to jurisdiction under the Federal Trade Commission, and it pulled broadband providers solely under the jurisdiction of the Federal Communications Commission. And then once we did that, we then started imposing regulations on one and not the other. I think that was the wrong approach. I think by reversing Title II, we've restored the Federal Trade Commission's authority, and then it can look comprehensively. You know, what should a broadband provider be doing? What should an edge provider be doing? Because at the end of the day, from a consumer perspective, you want to know that your privacy is being respected, that your data is being protected, and you shouldn't have to be either a regulatory lawyer or an engineer and say, well, this is my ISP, and they've got this data, so it's subject to this regime. This is Facebook, it's an edge provider, it's subject to this regime. That's why I think this is better, whether it's the Federal Trade Commission or Congress, to take a holistic view, make sure consumers are being protected, but not have an unlevel playing field when we're talking about actors in the same internet ecosystem.
We'll do one more question from the audience.
Chris Bowen, I'm with IBM. One of the things that's coming up on May 25th is the European regulation, GDPR, that gives European data subjects a lot of rights if the processor is processing data related to offering of goods and services. This seems to raise the prospect of contradictory obligations on the part of people in the United States who are providing telecommunications services if their services are being used. Does the FCC have any plans to help find harmony with the EU and the GDPR?
So again, this principally moves into the jurisdiction of the Federal Trade Commission, but I'll say this, when we applied our privacy rules, the Obama-era privacy rules to ISPs, they're actually in some ways stricter than what was being applied in GDPR, and that was one issue, is how do we sort of deal with that potential conflict between what we're saying to Europe is sufficient through the GDPR and our sort of discussions there, with what we then did with our broadband providers, which was go beyond that. Now we've pushed it back to the Federal Trade Commission, and they can take a holistic look at what the right approach is here.
Great. With that, thank you very much, Commissioner. Appreciate your time.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. That was terrific. So next up is David Redl, who is the Assistant Secretary for Commerce and Information and the Administrator at NTIA, a position he has held since November of 2017. Prior to that, he served as Chief Counsel on the for the U.S. House of Representatives, U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce. And prior to that, he was a Director of Regulatory Affairs at CTIA. Mr. Redl also earned his law degree from the Catholic University of America. In addition, he got his undergrad from Penn State. And David has been a longtime member of the Executive Committee of the Practice Group for Communications and Media at the Federalist Society. So we welcome up our longstanding friend and supporter, Mr. David Redl.
Well, thanks, Bryan. And like Commissioner Carr, Bryan has left out that I also was one of his students. Commissioner Carr was a year ahead of me at Catholic University, and so we've known each other for quite some time, and I'm happy to follow him here today to provide some color commentary on the ways that NTIA works in a complementary fashion within the executive branch to what our colleagues at the FCC do as an independent agency. It's great to be here. NTIA and the Department of Commerce, we spend all day thinking about the future of American leadership and how to advance our leadership in wireless and in 5G. I'd like to take some time to talk about a couple of our functions, or a number of functions NTIA undertakes, and those would be the functions of our role as principal advisor to the President on communications and information matters, and our role as the regulator of spectrum for federal government users, which leads us to bring spectrum to bear on commercial applications. This administration understands that we must connect all Americans to truly unlock the promise of the internet, and it's something that we have taken holistically across the executive branch, across this administration, as an order to bring the internet to the corners of America that have not yet realized its full benefits. Despite the fact that we have, as a country, had such incredible amounts of investment, as Commissioner Carr noted in his, we still have a digital divide in this country. And we've been spending a lot of time at NTIA working with our colleagues at the Department of Agriculture to look at ways to expand broadband into rural America. RUS's efforts on this front have been in dovetail with us as the co-chairs of the President's Broadband Interagency Working Group. And if I could take a few minutes, I'd like to give you a little bit of information about what we've been working on in that space. The top call to action from the President's task force for rural America was to connect rural America with high-speed internet. Doing so will be transformative for rural America, as it will improve health, as Commissioner Carr noted, education, promoting economic development, and unleashing American innovation. It'll mean more productive farms and small businesses. It'll mean opportunities for job training and for workplace development, and access to advanced technologies in global markets for rural Americans. Our working group is focused in three principal areas. The first area is looking at how to use federal facilities and federal lands to improve rural broadband. The United States government is the largest landowner in America and also has an extensive set of buildings and poles and other assets that can be used to help deploy both wireless and wired assets to bring rural Americans into the current generation of internet technologies. And so we're working with our colleagues across the federal government to find ways to streamline the process of making those assets available. The second area is federal funding of broadband. It will come as no surprise to members of the Federalist Society that there are times when the federal government needs to do a better job of coordinating across itself. The group is working on the effectiveness of various programs and how to make sure that as we have different parts of the federal government working to improve rural broadband, that we have coordination between those groups and those funding streams. In the spending bill passed last month, several agencies were tasked with broadband responsibilities, and we're looking forward to working with them. Those include our colleagues at the Rural Utility Service and our colleagues within the Commerce Department at the Economic Development Agency. The third area for the working group is leveraging federal assets for broadband deployment. And I touched a little bit on this. Interior has a number of towers that we are trying to get streamlined for access to those assets. We're also working to make sure that other fiber deployments that are part of the federal government can be brought to bear on these issues. The Rural Prosperity Task Force also recommended assessing the current state of broadband nationwide, and that's been a more recent focus for us at NTIA. Many of you may have noted that in the most recent omnibus spending bill, there was some funding provided for broadband mapping. We need accurate, reliable data to properly inform private sector companies and other regulators within the federal government how to make decisions as to where money should be best invested to ensure that the benefits of the internet are brought to every American. Congress asked NTIA to work with the FCC and with our sister agencies and with states and local governments with whom we have existing relationships to update the National Broadband Availability Map and to provide good and solid actionable information so we can better target funds allocated to broadband. This isn't a new area for NTIA. We've long been a leader in collecting and analyzing data on broadband adoption, and that data can then be used to inform policy. We have decades of experience analyzing broadband in the United States, and we've seen real results from the work our Broadband USA group has done with state and local governments who spend a lot of time thinking about how to make sure that their citizens have access to reliable broadband. Moreover, some of these states, in the wake of the last effort by the federal government to provide a map, have been willing to take on the challenge of keeping that data up to date, and so we're looking forward to working with them again as part of this effort. Broadband USA also works with communities to identify resources and provide technical assistance, and we've helped more than 250 communities develop public-private partnerships to meet their connectivity needs and digital inclusion goals. Through events, webinars, and other activities, Broadband USA is bringing together voices across the country to close the digital divide. And as we look into the future, it should come as no surprise that we spend a big chunk of our time on spectrum. Spectrum and sort of the wireless technologies that Commissioner Carr touched on for 5G have the promise to deliver dramatic increases in wireless broadband and to bring the value of wireless broadband to parts of rural America that have yet to receive those benefits. Whether it's paving the way for more advanced manufacturing, healthcare, or public safety comms, this is an area that we are focused at the moment. America is the world leader in Wi-Fi and 4G, and we're among the leaders in bringing 5G to reality. It is essential to American competitiveness that we not lose this edge we've had in wireless and that we regain the lead in 5G technologies. At NTIA, we're working to make sure there's enough spectrum to do so. Competitive, ubiquitous 5G in America is going to require spectrum in both the low, mid, and high bands, and one of NTIA's core missions is to strike a balance between the needs of government users and making sure there's effective spectrum available for our commercial sector. Thanks to the efforts of our Policy and Plan Steering Group, the PPSG, which is an advisory committee within the executive branch, NTIA was recently able to announce the selection of 3450 to 3550 megahertz as a candidate band for repurposing to commercial services. Let's be clear, we still have a lot of work to do to make this available, but the value here is that this spectrum is immediately adjacent to the FCC's CBRS spectrum at 3.5, and also would be contiguous with any spectrum hopefully made available through the FCC's efforts on 3.7 to 4.2. So we have a real opportunity here across our two agencies to find ways to make mid-band spectrum available contiguously for broadband services in America. NTIA is committed to developing and implementing these kinds of novel spectrum approaches, and we're happy to see that Congress is interested in these novel approaches as well, as is evidenced by the provisions of Ray Baum's Act, signed into law as part of the budget deal. It included a provision on researching incentives for agencies to relinquish or share spectrum, and it's something that we are actively working on and happy to be doing so. As we look for other tools, we're relying pretty heavily on our Institute for Telecommunications Sciences. This is a part of the NTIA that many people aren't familiar with, but is a lab run out of Boulder, Colorado that spends its time doing research and development work on spectrum interference matters. As I mentioned before, 3450 to 3550 is a candidate band for us and is immediately adjacent to CBRS. The 3.5 gigahertz spectrum for CBRS relies heavily on two pieces of equipment, the spectrum access system and the environmental sensing capability, both of which are currently being tested at our labs in ITS in order to ensure that this valuable spectrum can be brought to market in a way that protects incumbent systems. ITS is collaborating with all the interested stakeholders to certify that they're necessary and get them brought to market as soon as possible. Again, when combined with the recent announcement by the FCC on the C-band, this is a real opportunity for us to get contiguous mid-band spectrum brought to bear on our 5G challenges. We also welcome the FCC's recent vote approving an order using regulations to deploy wireless. As Commissioner Carr mentioned, it's a real value for us as we go forward to be able to look at ways to speed these things to market. Regulation can help or hinder, and in this case, the FCC has taken a real step to help. And also, there are auction rules for 24 and 28 gigahertz, which should help bring us closer to a 5G reality. They're important steps in securing America's 5G leadership, and I thank them for that. With that, I'll stop, and I'll look forward to joining my fellow panelists up here. So thank you very much.
So I'm going to bring up the other panelists at this point, and we'll have a conversation. You'll have a chance, the audience will have a chance to ask David and the rest of the panelists a question after we're up. So if Chip and Brad can come on up, that'd be great. And as they make their way up, I'll go ahead and begin the introductions. First is Chip Pickering, the CEO of ENCOMPAS since January 2014. Chip previously served as congressman representing Missouri's, that's my home state, Mississippi's 3rd District. Sorry, defaulted to that. Perhaps most importantly, two things are very important. One is that he helped shape the 1996 Telecommunications Act in his role as a staffer at the time. But equally important, and perhaps particularly in need right now, is he led a bipartisan legislative effort to modify and codify the net neutrality principles in the House in 2006. So maybe you can bring some of that wisdom forward to our discussion today. To his left is Professor Michelle Connolly. She's a professor of the practice in the economics department at Duke University. Also serves as the director of the honors program in economics and a member of the Duke Alumni Association Board. Previously, she served as the chief economist at the FCC not once but twice in 2006 and 7 and 2008 and 9, and as an economist for the International Research Function at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And finally, at the far left is Brad Gillen, who's the Executive Vice President at CTIA, the Wireless Association. Previously, Brad served as a partner at Wilkinson, Barker, Knauer, and as a legal advisor to Commissioner Baker, and previously served as well other senior roles at the FCC and at Dish Network. So our format for this afternoon was that we would give each of our new arrivals on the panel a few moments to react to Commissioner Carr and Administrator Redl's remarks, and then we can, from there, we'll open it up to larger questions. So with that, Chip.
Well, Bryan, thank you, and I want to thank the Federalist Society for the invitation to be part of this panel today. The Federalist Society, on a personal note, has been very important to my father, who is a federal judge and who is turning 81 in May and will be recognized on May 18th for the Ed Meese Originalism Award. And so to him, it's one of the great honors of his life. And so the Federalist Society has been critical and vital in being able to reshape the judiciary to look at the law as it was originally intended. And so it's a great privilege for me to be here with the panel today. What I would like to do is we look at the kind of the core question, the future of the internet and American leadership, is to step back a little bit and to kind of divide into three parts our discussion today. You know, the founding of the internet, the competitive age or the competition and commercial age of the internet, and then to kind of lay out what I see as the challenges for the future of the internet. INCOMPAS started out as COMTEL in 1981. We like to call ourselves the founding voice of competition. If you think of what was happening in the world in 1981, it was prior to the breakup or divestiture of AT&T. It was during the monopoly age of telecom and telecommunications by law. Everything was a monopoly service, whether it was in telephone, local cable. And it was the beginning, though, of what we can now refer to as the competitive age. And I want to kind of walk through what that means. I define myself and see myself as a competition conservative. That competition reduces the government's role in life by reducing regulation, allowing free market forces in the visible hand of the market to take over versus the government controlling all the approvals for the cost or setting the price, and instead the market doing that. And we have a remarkable story to tell in American leadership in competition policy and internet policy. If you look at the founding, though, of the internet, it was back when it was a defense and research network. And it was a period that set the founding principles of networks being interconnected, networks and devices being interoperable, protocols being developed so that scientists and researchers and academics could communicate and share information and discover in a way that was extremely collaborative, a multi-stakeholder process with those types of core principles. In 1984, we'll say that's the beginning of the competition age. And why is that relevant to the internet as we know it today? Well, in 1984, there was, from 34 to 84, there was one network, AT&T, Ma Bell, and long distance. It was copper, it was analog. At the breakup of AT&T in 84, within 5 years, Sprint, MCI, WorldCom, WorldTel, UUNet, and hundreds of others, small long-distance competitors, had created multiple fiber digital internet backbone long-haul global networks that allowed the computational capacity of the world to now be connected to fiber digital networks, which made the first half of the internet infrastructure possible. That happened within 5 years of competition being introduced into the market. We had 50 years of monopoly, 5 years of competition, and see what it brought. And the world and Congress especially, and Republicans led by President Reagan in the breakup of AT&T, which I would argue was actually the single most important domestic economic act of his administration, if you think about it. It ushered in the competition age. We gained the infrastructure of the modern age in the internet, which has revolutionized, as Commissioner Carr said, the single largest innovation in American history, the internet, into the largest global market that anyone could have ever imagined. Congress, seeing that long-distance competition worked, in 1992 said to the cable industry, which was a local monopoly, that we want the new entrant, the new technology, satellite, to have equal access to programming content. Now, why is that important and significant? So once satellite could enter the market and compete with equal access to programming, and they were digital, cable, which was analog and could do 30 channels, satellite could do 1,000 channels, cable had to respond to the new entrants, the new technology. And so they built new fiber digital infrastructure in the last mile. So now you have the infrastructure of both the last mile and long distance and global that is now fiber and digital. Then you get the cable modem, and the commercialization of the internet is now possible. So that worked in wired services. So in 1993, what does Congress do? They say, we're going to end a duopoly policy in cellular. We're going to have competitive auctions where you have up to 7 per market. We're going to create a competitive structure. And we will have a competitive wireless industry. So 1993, first auctions in 94, and within the last 20 years, we've gone through 4 generations of new technologies, new networks, and from analog to digital. And it made, if I could hold up my iPhone, it made the iPhone possible in 2007. So the competitive entry and long-distance competitive entry by satellite and cable and the competitive structure of wireless really gave us the infrastructure of wired and wireless that enabled the internet to then really take off. 96, a reform-minded Republican Congress saying that competition is going to be the law of the land, then enacted what is our current law that promotes competition in a light touch regulatory framework. It made all networks interconnect. It made wireless a competitor to wireline by giving access to wireline networks at a market-based price or cost versus being blocked by high access charges or termination fees. So the wireless industry with interoperability, interconnection, interoperability of devices, those are the light touch regulatory approaches to be successful in a functioning market. In 1997-98, as a new freshman member of Congress, I got to chair the committee that transitioned the internet from government to private sector, multi-stakeholder domain names registries. And then in 2003, Michael Powell, as chairman of the FCC, set the first net neutrality policy. Kevin Martin, the next Republican chair of the FCC, enforced net neutrality principles. And in 2006, we had a bipartisan bill that passed through the House. I think it was close to 400 votes that codified net neutrality principles. And now we get to Commissioner Carr's points on the open internet. There's not the dissent over the principles, the policies. You could go through the last 4 chairmen, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and you could have a basic consensus around no blocking, no throttling, prioritization. You might have a little bit of disagreement. We believe interconnection should be a key cornerstone of competition policy, and that the FCC should have jurisdiction over the network. As Commissioner Carr pointed out, there should be regulatory parity on privacy and those types of issues at the FTC. The question is, after this going back and forth over the last 8 years, between a 2010 order, a 2015 order, and now a 2017 order, the fear that I have for the internet policy is that it's being fragmented and balkanized by now states reacting to the FCC repeal of the net neutrality protections, each setting their own policy, and what has been a national success story is now filled with uncertainty, unpredictability, and fragmentation. I do think Congress needs to step in and set a permanent solution that would codify the 4 cornerstones of net neutrality protections: no blocking, no throttling, no prioritization, and oversight of interconnection. Hopefully we can recreate the consensus, the national consensus of the country had around internet policy. And then final, the future is 5G and how we can deploy networks and have spectrum policy. And I want to commend both Commissioner Carr and David Redl for their leadership on the deployment agenda and on spectrum policy. David, over the last, how many years, 10 or so, has been the primary leader in Congress, setting good competition and auction policy. If we can get to 5G first, and there's a race with China for both economic and national security interest, those are the things that we can do to make sure that the internet continues to be, and our networks, competitive and open, and that we have the American leadership that we need. With that, I will end my filibuster and hand it to
I was a little worried around 97 that we were not going to actually get to 18, but it well worked out. Ms. Connolly.
Thank you. So I have good news and bad. Good news and bad news. Good news, I got all my notes on one page.
Excellent.
Bad news is it's about 25 slides on PowerPoint. As an economist, and I apologize if you've heard me speak before, but I always like to actually read the numbers on deployment of broadband because everyone's always talking about it, stating things as if they're well-known facts, and oftentimes what is being stated is completely false. I was at a panel with someone on a very high-level commission, very high agency, and they made a comment along the lines of 95% of Americans only have one internet service provider. Luckily, I had with me the actual numbers, and I corrected the statement. But
how'd that go?
they did not respond. All right, so let me just say what the actual facts are, not the hypothetical facts, not my perceptions of the facts. These are the facts in terms of the true measures that we have. Now, there can be discussion about how good these measures are, how accurate they are, but these are the measures that we actually have. So in terms of broadband deployment, if we look at different speeds, and if we include satellite, because satellite is now able to get certain speeds of upload and download. If we're looking at census blocks with housing units, so a census block can still be quite large, and the information I'm telling you about comes from a form which only asks if at least one person is receiving service in that block. So you could certainly have a part of a block where there is service and a part of a block where there is not. So this tends to be an overestimate of availability, but it's the only thing we have. If we look at a minimum speed of 100 megabits per second download, 1 megabits per second upload, 100% of census blocks in the United States have that, at least one provider or more, 100%. 98% have 2 providers or more at that speed. 82% of census blocks have 3 providers or more at that speed. Now, most recently, every couple of years, the official speed at which the FCC recognizes that service is providing broadband is increased. So, for example, in the 2015 order, the order said that in order to be recognized as high-speed broadband service, it now had to be at 25 megabits per second minimum download and 3 megabits per second upload. If we use those numbers, 87% of U.S. census blocks with housing units have that, at least one provider. 56% have 2 providers or more, and 26% have 3 providers or more. So this is just to point out that the common statements about access tend to be overly exaggerated. Now, the other thing I want to point out is that most people here are talking about deployment, and that's clearly a crucial component. And the reason we're so interested in that is because we do continue to see a strong difference between rural and urban areas. If we're looking just at fixed terrestrial broadband, I'll take, again, the lowest level, like 10 megabits per second, download one up. In urban settings, 99% of the census blocks have that. But in rural settings, only 84%. So there is definitely a divide that's occurring between urban and rural areas. But more importantly, the divide isn't just between urban and rural. If we look at the Pew Center and we look at the reason, or let's look at the people who use the internet or who have internet access at home. Of those who don't, there are 4 primary categories. People over the age of 65, almost half of them don't have internet access at home. If someone does not have a high school degree, 66% of those individuals do not have internet access at home. If they earn less than $30,000 a year, 47%, almost half, don't have internet access at home. And if they're rural, 37% do not have access at home. Now, the thing to notice is that the rural population is on average older, less educated, has lower income, and is in an area with less deployment. But the point here is that access is deployment is a necessary factor. Without that, no one will be able to access it. But it can be available and still not be adopted. And a large part of this digital divide is a question of adoption and not just access. When Pew asked in 2015, they asked the households who said they did not have access in their homes. 7% of those respondents said that access or lack of infrastructure, which included meaning not having a computer, 7% of them said that was why they did not have access or did not have internet at home. 19% said price. And my guess is over time that may become more of an issue as people see access as less of a problem and pricing may be a larger impediment to lower income households. 34% said lack of relevance. So this is an issue of content or a lifestyle where people are not interacting with the information that is on the internet. And 32% said lack of digital literacy. That's certainly something that can change, it will change over time and can change over time, but that's not something that we can change simply by increasing deployment. So once we're thinking about these issues of the digital divide, we want to improve deployment, but we also want to consider all these other aspects. Another point I want to make is in terms of the discussions of the net neutrality order, the open internet order, which was at least justified on grounds of trying to help reduce the digital divide. It really did 2 things which would only exacerbate the digital divide. One is by blocking paid prioritization, we get something called a water bucket effect. You're creating a block. So there's a market. If someone wants to pay for a certain service in order to get improved quality of service, but the government says, no, that is not allowed, I'm forcing that price to be 0. But you have to provide the service. So that's an implicit subsidy from the internet service provider to a content service provider who might otherwise want and need that. It also means that if they want a super high quality of service, and they may not be able to get that on the average quality of service if there's no differential pricing, then they won't be able to even compete on the market. So in that sense, those edge providers are being blocked out if there's no such thing as paid prioritization. Secondly, we have the water bed effect, that by lowering the price for potential content service providers, especially those who need high quality of service or potentially those who are creating significant amounts of congestion, if you push on a waterbed on one end, the other end pops up. So what happens here is you're pushing down the price that the internet service provider can charge for specific types of services. It's going to raise the average price, meaning the average price to the average consumer, so not the Netflix consumer who's part of the reason why there's all this congestion, but someone who may be at a lower income level may not have Netflix, may not have all these gaming situations, would like the internet but doesn't need that level of service. Well, now they're being asked to pay a higher price. So if anything, that's going to make it more difficult for lower income families to have that internet service in their house. Also, it means that an internet service provider is having to eat some of this profit. And that means they're going to be less interested at the margin in deploying to lower income and more rural areas than they would otherwise. So at the margin, the net neutrality order as it was imposed in 2015, but I'm going to refer specifically to the no paid prioritization, because in economic terms that is a key thing, has a very negative effect on the digital divide, and it's for that reason that I'm very happy that it was reversed. I agree with Chip in the sense that I do believe Congress needs to step in to create some certainty about this regulation, to understand so that people can invest and know what is going to be the landscape for the internet. And I would agree with all the points you made, except for the no paid prioritization, because as an economist, that's actually a crucial issue. That's not just fluff. That's not just saying, oh, but we don't want a general standard rule. No paid prioritization is really saying the government is intervening in a market and saying that that market either cannot exist or must exist at a zero price. And for anyone who believes in markets, that's not an optimal outcome. So I make a big point of that. I'll leave it at that.
There you go. Made a big point of that and seen. Okay. Brad, you want to back clean up for us, and then we'll come back and engage in some debate, it sounds like.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for having me. I now have another reason to hate waterbeds. I agree with everything Michelle just said in terms of and I want to steal Chip's line of being a competition conservative as well. I like that one. And the power of wireless to really, through competition, drive so many things. And the part of what Commissioner Carr and Administrator Redl talked about today is building that foundation for next generation investment. And I almost want to cede my time back to them because they said everything I'd like to say and better than I'm about to say it. But just want to give you some idea of why what they talk about matters to you and what matters to our American competitiveness going forward. That we talk about a broadband regime that's ready to promote investment and innovation right now. We talk about looking at how we are going to site infrastructure in this country, and are we ready to site entirely different types of networks, as Commissioner Carr talked about. And then spectrum. Wireless doesn't work without spectrum, and that is something uniquely the government has a huge role on. And one of the first things Administrator Redl did was identify midband as an international global priority and moved very quickly to start that process, and we appreciate his efforts there. But I think for us, why do we care about 5G? And I think you've heard about it, and I was very excited that everyone except Michelle mentioned 5G, but we'll get 5G at some point today. And it really is, we are at an inflection point as a country that we'll start seeing these services later this year, which is kind of crazy to talk about. This was always viewed as something 2020 or beyond. We'll have these Jetson-like things. There'll be remote surgery, connected cars, and anything else you liked growing up as some sort of future thing. But it's coming very fast, and we need policymakers' action. And we're very optimistic we're going to get that because of the two you heard from this morning. That they get it. They understand the consequences we're in. That if you're talking about, why does this matter for the United States? It's $500 billion to our economy if we get this right. It's 3 million new jobs throughout the country that this platform will support. And the challenge we have as a country is other countries have seen how important 4G leadership was. We alluded to it, a number of us already. And the apps economy is here, in large part because we have the best connectivity. Why do you see innovation centers from international companies like Ericsson and Samsung here? Because we have that connectivity base here. And so China is very much from an industrial perspective, from their commercial sector and their government sector, want that 5G race. We released research yesterday that has the U.S. currently third, behind South Korea and China. And the key is, while the industry is gearing up and ready to invest roughly $275 billion of private capital, zero government money needed, but $275 billion over the next 10 years to build these 5G networks, we do need government help. And again, we've identified already a number of the places where it's important, that we need a broadband platform that creates certainty and doesn't have the state-by-state issue that Chip alluded to. and doesn't have the overhang of Title II and the pay prioritization rules of the Wheeler regime that Commissioner Carr spoke so eloquently about the damage that does to investment. We also need infrastructure reform. If we're going to build these new networks, we're going to need roughly 800,000 small cells in the next 10 years. Under the current rules, we built 150,000 towers over 30 years. It's been a great roadmap to build a giant tower. It's not going to work. We're not going to win that race. And so what Commissioner Carr led last month in terms of federal reform is critical to reduce the cost and speed that deployment. And the next part of that is on the local zoning side, that we need that same focus there that has another impact on deployment. And the last piece is spectrum. And the FCC today announced auction as early as November on high band spectrum. The reports this week really highlighted that as a global race aspect, it's the mid-band spectrum that is really where the U.S. is falling behind. And really it's an opportunity, as Mr. Redl has already identified it. The FCC has 2 proceedings looking at how to do that. But that's something we really need to see happen. So I think we have the ability to win this race, and it's a race that we're all need to and want to win. And we're excited to get that regulatory structure in place to do so.
Great, thank you, Brad. So I was going to turn it over to you, David, if you have any reaction to the panelists, or if you want to go to other questions.
Let's go right to questions.
Okay, so one thing that Chip flagged was this 50-state component. And whether it's infrastructure deployment or privacy or net neutrality, one of the big threats that's been identified by the industry is the notion of moving in 50 different directions when it comes to these policy matters. So I don't know, maybe David, if you don't mind starting with the importance of a national regime on these issues, and then maybe we can have Michelle and Brad also react to what Chip had originally pointed out.
Sure, thanks, Brian. When it comes to all of these things, I think it's a pretty well-established principle within communications policy that it makes good sense to have one set of rules. We've seen the results that come. Chip did a much better job of detailing how having uniform policy directed by Congress can really lead to good competition policy at the ground level. On every one of those issues, I think this is not the first time that we've had these conversations. These are long-term, ongoing conversations about what our national policies are going to look like in those spaces. I welcome the discussion, and certainly to the extent that NTIA is participating in those, we'll continue to monitor and make sure that we are informing the president's decisions on those. The administration hasn't taken a position on whether or not we should have a specific piece of legislation there or not, but it's something that we're certainly paying very close attention to.
When you think when something like infrastructure comes up, obviously localities are used to having a fair amount of control. And so there is a tension between sort of traditional Federalist principles and some of the issues we're describing here. So maybe taking off your NTIA hat for a second and maybe putting on your old CTIA hat. But how does that conversation go? Is it a matter of just that there's not enough understanding among state and local leaders about the role that these technological innovations could play for their communities, or how do you think about that problem?
Well, we spend a lot of time at NTIA working with state and local leaders to make sure that they understand the marketplace that broadband brings to them. And we have an entire team at NTIA, the Broadband USA team, that grew out of the BTOP program. Once the grant program had exhausted itself, the question became, how do we leverage these relationships? How do we leverage the expertise we have generated in looking at broadband infrastructure at a less than national level? And we've managed to do a good job of maintaining those relationships. And our state broadband leaders network continues to be a venue where we can bring together in smaller settings. We just got done doing a workshop in Tennessee. We could bring together state and local leaders who can then share what's worked and what hasn't in getting private sector investment in their areas. And frankly, we can also use that to leverage our ability to get access to information. States like Minnesota have continued to do a really good job of maintaining maps and maintaining good data on broadband availability in their state. And as we look forward at the larger challenge of mapping within the country, what the infrastructure challenge we're facing is going to look like, having smart conversations with state and local leaders is going to be a critical component of that, and making sure that they know what the challenges they're going to face are.
I want to put a pin in mapping because I want to come back to that. But Michelle and Brad, any reactions on the role of state and local government in issues like net neutrality, privacy, infrastructure?
Absolutely. I think I would separate infrastructure from the internet, net neutrality and privacy, so let's do those first. And I think from our perspective, the FCC's got the policy right and said that this is an interstate service, and the states are really preempted from doing this. And so I think for us, it's really troubling if you think about kids in the backseat of the car watching Netflix movie, and the internet rules change when they cross over the Potomac River from Virginia into DC rules, into Maryland rules, and your experience changes 3 times potentially, whether it be a prioritization rule or a throttling rule or whatever it is. That's not a way to run this rodeo. And so we really do think that's a place that it only makes sense for national rules, and that's part of the reason we've done so well from wireless policy and internet policy, is that we have focused on a federal regime. On the infrastructure, I actually don't think there's really a difference today from where we have been since 1993, when we've always said there's a federal policy in support of nationwide wireless services. And that requires guardrails and guidelines to local states and communities. They can say yes and no. They have aesthetic and zoning and safety concerns, but it is completely the federal government's purview to say, you can't require wireless things to be built underground. Doesn't work that way. You can't just say no. You got to say yes or no within a certain amount of time. And if there's a shot clock, in basketball, at the end of the shot clock, the other team gets the ball. Right now, in a lot of communications policy, at the end of the shot clock, nothing happens. And so I think when you think about what we're talking about in terms of a local government, is really in our minds not new preemption or it really isn't preemption in our eyes. It really is looking at updating rules that were designed for analog early digital wireless services for today's wireless services. So I think the states and local communities always have to have a role. It's their community, it's their constituencies they're protecting, but that it has to be looked under the umbrella of a federal policy that we need to promote as a nation.
Great. Before we pivot to mapping, Michelle or Chip, do you want to jump in on this?
I'll just quickly jump into how a national framework gives certainty for investment and everything else. I do want to respond to Michelle's point on priority, just very, very quickly.
I was going to save that for later, but all right, go ahead.
Well, if you want to save it for later, I can wait.
It's all right.
Yes,
All right. Let's do, because that's going to be the fireworks at the end. We want to have that guy. Everybody's in the audience. Great for that. Mapping. So Michelle pulled out some data on the state of competition across the marketplace. And one of the things you conceded, I think, was that the notion that the data is the best we have. And David, you talked about the importance of mapping. So David, maybe talk in a little more detail about where the mapping process is, what you think the gaps are, and then I'd like the panel to weigh in on what the accurate mapping means for public policy for all of you as former policymakers, but also from where you sit in your current roles.
Sure. Thanks, Bryan. So in the most recent fiscal year 18 appropriations vehicle, NTIA was given $7.5 million to go forth and try to find ways to improve the national broadband availability map. As Michelle noted, the data we have is the data we have, and it serves as a good starting point for us to continue going forward. But I think, I don't need to pile on. I think a number of people have already commented on what they think the downfalls are of the current data set and the need for additional, more granular or more validated data. This is an issue that NTIA filed on behalf of the administration with the FCC recently, figuring out ways to improve the FCC's Form 477 data. The FCC currently has the best data on this, at least in terms of the federal government. And unfortunately, that data still lacks the kind of clarity, the kind of accuracy, and the kind of granularity I think that everyone acknowledges we would like to have. We're now taking the money that was put forth in the appropriations vehicle and trying to figure out what the best way is to use that $7.5 million to augment what's already being done. And that's figuring out what data sets do we have within the federal government that we can bring to bear on this challenge. It's how can we work with the FCC and the work they've done. And they've done great work in taking the data they have and finding ways to present it in ways that both consumers can use it and ways that policymakers can use it. How can we take all of that in and find ways to make it more granular and more usable for policymakers? We spent a lot of time doing this over the last 10 years at NTIA, and the first iteration of the broadband map was an NTIA product. And a lot of that was time spent working on validation. As Michelle noted, the data we have looks at whether there is availability in a given census block, which is, not all census blocks are created equal. Let's just say that. Some are bigger than others, some are more populated than others, and finding ways to produce data that tells us a little more about the ground truth as to whether or not a service is in fact available in a given location is what we are trying to figure out how best to attack with this project.
And once you have the data, what will you do with it, or what do you envision being done with it that'll make it public policy better, just to make it tangible for everybody?
Well, for example, so I will take off my NTIA hat and put on my hat from having been a congressional staffer. There was a lot of consternation about federal grants being given out over the last 10 years without the data to actually show that there was a need for investment in that place. We don't want the federal government to be overbuilding areas where there is already service. We don't want the federal government to be investing money in places where you might get economic investment but haven't yet. We want to be able to leverage assets that the federal government has already paid for and are on the ground that we can use to further our efforts. And so this kind of mapping effort also dovetails with the work we're doing in the Broadband Interagency Working Group to try and work across the federal government to say, okay, we've got these federal assets here, we've got these assets that were paid for by private capital, we've got these assets that were paid for by federal grants. How do we make sure all of them are being leveraged in a way that produces the best outcome for Americans? I don't have all the answers on that at this point, and it's very early in stages. I mean, the fiscal year money was only appropriated a month ago. So we are currently trying to tackle that with the $7.5 million that NTIA has been given. We would welcome suggestions from folks on how we can do that. We certainly would welcome any data that people would like to share with us that we can use to improve policymakers' tools. But we're still trying to figure out exactly how we're going to tackle it.
Michelle?
So I can give a really concrete example because in my lab we've been looking at the Form 477 data. In the debate when people were talking about the impact of the open net order on investment, people were showing these aggregate numbers, but they were aggregate numbers on total capital expenditures. And it was impossible just based on that to know, okay, we can observe that this has happened. We don't know where it's happening within the United States or why it's happening. And without being able to look at it at a granular level, you don't really have the information to disentangle those issues. So you can make an observation, but you don't know what the causality is or how much of it can be attributed to one factor or another. So we've been trying to look at the Form 477 data specifically to see if it changed the rates of or the likelihoods of new entry into census blocks of an ISP that was not there prior in previous times. Also to see maybe what might be happening to the average speed or the max speed, and if that rate of change was impacted by these things or not. But even by working as hard as we can, we're very limited because it's so chunky, and also until 2016, a lot of the information was voluntary.
Right.
Yeah. So if you're trying to look at time series, it's very difficult. I know with the previous economists, when we were working at the FCC, we wanted to look at things over time. The data set had not been linked to identify firms consistently over time. They do that now, but that did not used to be. So there's a big issue that if we're spending all this time to get the data, there really is a value to organizing it, to making sure that there's enough granularity that it's useful to say something, and that it is useful for someone who's not working at the FCC, because part of my thought on the disconnect between the general population and trust in government is the fact that people keep just making random statements and not backing them up with any facts. And a lot of the data I'm talking about are publicly available data, but I've worked at the FCC and I have 9 people in my lab, and it still takes us a year to collect some of this stuff. So that should be part of the job, not just for the FCC and making their own policies, but also to demonstrate to industry and to the population that when we are making these decisions, it's based on real information, and they can at least check for themselves to see if what we're saying has any validity or not.
Do any states or other countries do a better job on mapping? Is there some place to point for a model?
Well, I can't say that I don't know necessarily about other countries or other states. One thing I do know for some other research of mine, we ended up getting data from Ookla, which is the speed data test, because that was much more, there was more information in that data than what we could get from the Form 477. So it shows that there's a private incentive to collect a lot of this, and that might be something that the FCC should look into, how they might bridge
There you
that.
go. You can crowdsource the whole thing. Brad or Chip on this one?
Sure, and I think the idea of what NTI is endeavoring and what the FCC has worked on the Mobility Fund and others is really, there's a limited amount of money available to help make sure all Americans benefit from broadband. And the worst thing to do is to spend that money for those that already have it, because then you're overbuilding somebody who actually built it with private capital, and you're not actually solving the problem for the Americans that don't have that connectivity. I think one of the things we always struggle with as the wireless industry, and sort of a lot of what Michelle started talking about, wireless sometimes doesn't even count as broadband with these maps. It's like we don't exist. So I think part of it is the reality of American consumers increasingly pick wireless as their broadband solution, and there's economic reasons for it, there's choice reasons, but that you can't have a conversation, you can't have a broadband map without wireless to really tell the story of where we are as Americans. And I think the only other thing I'd say about maps is we have to find the right balance, and that better maps require better data, but that data also come with cost, and that the amount of how many times different carriers are asked for data by different people, we need to make sure we're doing this in a way that makes sense. It's similar to how they do it in their own businesses, and also respectful of this is really commercially sensitive information about where facilities are, where towers are, that everything Michelle wants to see as to how a company builds census tract to census tract. I don't want that guy to know that. And so we just need to make sure we have that balance of getting the right data, but also respectful that it is not without cost.
Let me just add real quickly, getting the right data is very important. And to the larger point, if you ask most Americans, is there enough competition for wired broadband service? And the answer would be no, especially in rural markets. If you look at wired broadband, and this is where Michelle and I would disagree, and even the FCC would say that wireless and satellite are not very good substitutes for wired broadband. And for the vast majority of homes and businesses, not census tracts, but homes and businesses where actual people either work or reside, an overwhelming majority of the American public has a choice of 1 to 2 at most. What we do want is a competitive market structure more like wireless than what we have on wired. And this is where the effort by the Commission and Commissioner Carr is so critically important, and the mid-band spectrum auctions are so important. How do you get fixed in fiber and new entrants? Because once you get new entrants building new networks, you'll see what's happened in Detroit with Rocket Fiber, in San Francisco with Sonic, Google Fiber, and Austin and Utah, C-Spire Fiber in towns like Jackson and Starkville, Mississippi, is that once you get a third entrant into a market, then capacity, then the incumbents respond. They build new networks and new capacity. They lower their prices. They improve their service. And then everybody gets better broadband, and we get abundance. And the other thing is, and this gets into the priority, people go from limited to unlimited. They go from priority and preference to equal access and abundant supply, both broadband and the content that flows over the networks.
So pivoting to competition, I think it's a great segue. How are we doing as a country compared to the rest of the world? And Chip flagged a number of places where competition policy is really essential to making sure we're driving value for consumers. Are we doing the right things when it comes to competition policy in this country today? I don't know, Brad, Michelle, David, whoever would like to pop in.
I think I could be pretty brief on this. I think we're doing a great job. In terms of looking at the amount of choices, you could go to Pentagon City Mall and change your wireless carrier 4 different times and probably get 2 new phones and maybe even a coupon by the time you're done. So I really think that we have a competitive environment out there that's driving great results for consumers. I think the proof is in your bill that you have wireless service went up speed 19% last year and the prices went down 12%. there are very few industries anywhere that could say something like that. So I think a lot of that is driven by competition policy that supports 96% of Americans have 3 or more 4G choices. Most Americans have the full 4. So I think for us, we have a foundation in which let us compete and let us do the best for Americans. And I think we have a structure right now in place that's happening.
I think I would also be remiss at this point if I didn't put in a plug for the work that is being done by both the Department of Commerce and by the FCC to help spur deployment of new satellite platforms for broadband. The FCC's recent action to make licensing for small sats streamlined, as well as the efforts that Secretary Ross has been undertaking within the Department of Commerce to streamline the functions of the department within an Office of Space Commerce that will be under the Secretary. I think we're all trying to find ways to promote that platform as a competitive platform with this next generation of small sats and the large constellations that we're looking at.
Okay, anybody else, Michelle or Ray? Okay, well, I want to pivot. Speaking of Secretary Ross, we've had a big week, and I can't say when we put this panel together we saw this coming, but I'll take full advantage of it nonetheless. It's been a big week on national security issues for telecom infrastructure. We saw the action by the Commerce Department yesterday against ZTE. The FCC launched a rulemaking today about the role of certain manufacturers and who should be or not be receiving universal service support. How do issues related to supply chain fit into U.S. global leadership, and how should we look through at that problem through this lens? I'd like to.
Yes, I'll start. Certainly, I'll take from where you went on the action taken by the department this week. That's not NTIA's. That's our Bureau of Industry and Security that took action with respect to ZTE. I think it's important to note this was a regulatory action, and it was for violation of previous actions that had been taken by the administration against ZTE, and this, in fact, was because they had lied to the U.S. government as part of their probationary period. But it's been very clear in this administration that national security and communication security are joined at the hip. And so as we have been looking, since the president made that announcement as part of his national security strategy, that secure 5G would be part of our national security strategy, NTIA and the entire U.S. government has been focused on how do we make sure we are working with our private sector partners to ensure that we are providing the tools to the private sector to make sure that we have secure communications capability in this country. I think the action by BIS is another step in that direction, and certainly is following through on what they had said in 2017. But it's clear from the president and from everyone within this administration, we're going to continue pushing forward to make sure that our nation's communications network are secured.
Others on this topic, global competitiveness?
Sure. From our perspective, I think none of the promise of 5G or even 4G happens unless you are secure and safe in your connection. When we start talking about healthcare, connected car, and everything that comes next, it's paramount that you are secure and that our nation's interests are secure. So I think this is one that there's close collaboration between industry and government as to what is that appropriate lines. I think right now as we start the conversation at the FCC in particular, it is understanding the global supply chain and the reality of where a lot of this equipment is coming from, and the reality of there's a lot of equipment in this country now that may or may not be viewed as problematic. ZTE is the 4th largest smartphone provider in the country today. And so I think we just need to make sure that we look at this from the impact on Americans, on our safety, and I think the FCC is starting a process, and this is ongoing conversation happening on the Hill in the administration, and I think it's about finding that right balance of preserving our national interest while also recognizing this is and will always be a global market.
I just want to make a comment from the perspective of an economist, this is perhaps not the best analogy, but I think that we worry a lot about safety in our cars, right? And most of our cars come from lots of different countries, or in fact, each car probably comes from 20 different countries because different parts are made in different places. So the governments have always been interested in protecting us, and there are means by which to do that without precluding all foreign dimensions within the supply chain. And when you do that, or if you do that in too free a fashion, you're really going to diminish the productivity growth and the growth in the sector, and that would really be harming the U.S. consumer more than anything else. Now, of course, I'm saying that without saying that you give away all American information and military intelligence and things of that nature, but inherently, everything you're touching right now comes from many different countries, and it doesn't necessarily put us at risk.
Okay. So speaking of risk, we talked a lot about internet openness and the importance of it. I'm going to let Chip get back to his prioritization point here. So when I ask the panel what each of you think is the biggest risk to internet openness, and then also, since we are on this topic, your view on paid prioritization. And maybe we'll start with you, Chip, just spontaneously.
Well, you can have an open internet, what we've known as net neutrality, which is basically a policy of equal access. And it was started again by Republicans, that any consumer has the right to access any content on an equal basis on the internet, and then all content websites have equal access through the network to the consumer. So that is a policy of equal access. Now, where do those principles come from as a conservative free market advocate? They come from free market principles of no blocking is that you can't block trade at the port. No throttling is that you can't slow it down or you can't have quotas or allocations for some products or the other. And then the whole principle of comparative advantage, or the principle of this free trade is based on, is equal reciprocal access to markets. So we have the same equal access to Great Britain and to Ghana, and they have equal access to us. And when it's equal, then there are no distortions or corruptions of the marketplace. The best product at the best price with the best service and the most efficient allocation of capital wins. That is why the internet business model over the last 3 decades has created more wealth than any time in American history, and companies that are only 19 years old, 14 years old, 11 years old have the greatest valuations of any company in the history of the world. It is because of this principle of global, international, equal access, connectivity, and content flows that do not have distortions or gatekeepers. Don't have unequal treatment. Now, if you want your internet to be like cable service, raise your hand. If you want it to be like the postal service, raise your hand. If you want it to be like airlines, raise your hands. Those are systems of paid prioritizations, and they're not very efficient, and consumers in the market are rejecting them. 22 million people cut the cord last year on cable. The streaming revolution is in full force because they're creating great content that consumers and the market wants. Netflix will invest $10 billion into original content next year. Again, paid prioritization will only distort the market, and they'll put Home Depot at the advantage over small-town, Main Street, rural hardware stores. One will pay a priority, and one will get a slow lane. Now, that's not the way the internet works today, nor should it.
So actually, that is the way it works today, because Netflix pays content delivery networks to hold content closer to the subscribers so that their content can arrive more quickly to the subscribers. So even under the open internet order, it was perfectly legal to have some type of prioritization as long as they were paying a content delivery network and not the ISP. So that is not entirely true in that sense. Also, the issue about paid prioritization is really not about what is available, but it's about quality of service. So Chip mentions the best service. If you are trying to offer a service that absolutely needs a guaranteed quality of service, so if you're doing open heart surgery remotely, you cannot have information lost halfway through. What happens in congestion, so these are not actually, and I only learned this like 2 weeks ago at another event, but apparently it's not that there's actually a fast lane and a slow lane. There's just one lane, and when congestion occurs, packets of information that are being transferred, if there's a congestion, some of them have to be dropped out. And it can either they can be randomly dropped out, or they can be selectively dropped out. So if you have a service that requires a guaranteed quality of service, you could pay to make sure that your packets are prioritized so that they are the least likely to be dropped out. That doesn't mean that the other information cannot go through. It's only going to be in the situation of congestion. And when the congestion, more than 80% of the data that are going over our broadband lines are video content by the exact same groups who were lobbying for the net neutrality proposition. So there is already some type of prioritization. It just that CDNs could be paid for, but ISPs could not. B, it is about allowing competition through quality of service, as opposed to forcing just one type of quality of service. I would argue that I'm really happy that I have the ability to pay for 2-day delivery of mail versus just regular mail. I think that's better. I think as a consumer, that's better. So anyways, as an economist, that's not a point I can relinquish.
Chip, I suspect you'd like to come back. We're going to throw it up to audience questions after this little round robin, so go ahead, Chip.
A couple of things. One, the CDN really is a conflation. They're networks that create greater efficiency and storage at the edge, so that the edge providers or Netflix or content companies can deliver the content, have it stored efficiently, and then delivered to end users and consumers effectively. It is not a priority system. It is an efficiency network. And there's a vast difference between an ISP market, where you have only one or two choices for the vast majority of Americans, and CDNs that are very, very competitive in transport and transit, where you have multiples of providers of those CDNs, from AT&T, Comcast, to all the content companies, to CenturyLink, to Level 3. One is a competitive market that is bringing billions of websites and millions of apps and streaming and video, and the CDNs simply are the way of storing it efficiently to then go through the last mile and hopefully a competitive and equal basis.
Final volley.
Just sort of the wireless industry's perspective, because I think a lot of the net neutrality debate comes down to something Chip just said. There's one choice. You got 4 for me, but the rules are still the same. And so I think the struggle that we have is that the role of competition to control this. Because we all want to go wherever we want on the internet, 100%. And we all want these next great things to come, and we're not really sure how they're going to work. And I like Michelle's formulation of quality of service, that we're going to need quality of service around how a car, a healthcare service is going to be provided. And we could either have government in 2018 say, these are the rules, this is what prioritization means, it applies to everybody 3 years from now, or do we say in a competitive market like wireless, we're going to let the companies figure out what Americans want, what is that quality of service, and that I am confident, looking at the Twitter accounts of the CEOs in our industry, if anyone's blocking anyone, or anyone is doing anything to create money or leverage, the other guys are going to kill that guy, and people are going to run with their pocketbook. So I think when we have this conversation about, it isn't whether or not you want to go wherever you want, it's what's the best way to protect that. And we think that particularly in an industry like wireless, there is the competitive ability to check that behavior and create the flexibility to figure out what Americans want and how this technology evolves. So I think it isn't a matter of the end point, it's about what are the consequences of getting it wrong in regulation versus the power of competition to drive the better result.
Let me maybe step back and reach a point of agreement or consensus. We do support, and maybe sometimes our language we talk past each other, specialized services like telemedicine, connected cars, what needs to be a dedicated, secure, reliable service, we support. And some people might say that's a paid prioritization. We look at it as a specialized service. If the broader broadband internet access service is treated on an equal access basis, that's the way that part of the market should be. There are some services that should be dedicated and specialized, which we would support.
All right, audience questions? You want to go ahead and use the microphone before I get yelled at, because we had an incident before. I try not to get in trouble.
Sorry. Hi, Professor Connolly. I had a question for you, Ray Hashem. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting that you mentioned about paid prioritization is one of the concerns everybody has about net neutrality is this idea that ISPs could charge both ends of the connection, the user and the edge provider. And if you look at other countries, sometimes that's not a bad thing. So in Japan and Hong Kong, the transit providers charge the user, and they also own the real estate around the store, right? They lease out the property around the train station. And so they are able to capture what would otherwise be an uncaptured externality. So what do you think? Do you think that the ability to charge both ends would necessarily be a bad thing for ISPs?
No, I don't think it's a bad thing. It's a two-sided market by definition. So it should be within the realm of possibility unless the government intervenes to say that it's not possible. It also, simply because it's allowed doesn't mean that there will be a positive price charged. For most content, there would be no reason for that, and there'd be no positive price charge for those types of things. But for services that absolutely need it, in this case what Chip's calling specialized services, but it could also be, I'm happy to call it specialized services, but then who defines if you qualify for that status? I never expected a self-driving car 10 years ago. Who's to know what in 15 years needs that same qualification? So I think it's a market. We should allow the market to function and to function freely, unless there's a case of legal wrongdoing, in which case we have laws in place and we have had previous fines for firms who are not behaving properly.
When you think of two-sided markets that work particularly well, I often hear newspapers, credit cards. Are there other places you point to?
Credit cards is the prototypical
defining
example. In fact, that's how one of my students first taught me about the Waterberg effect.
Ah, very good.
Right. The idea that
Brad's favorite.
right.
Hi, I have a couple questions. The spectrum, when you speak about it to people, a lot of times they say, "Oh, the mall in L.A." They don't have an understanding of it.
Right.
And one of the things after the Sprint Nextel was the whole thing, people learned, or certain people, doctors and whatnot, were going to investment seminars where they could buy into a license.
Right.
And so we have all this real estate in the sky now. And the public doesn't understand it, and they don't understand how they can buy into it and the licensing process of it. And there are some companies out there that have been disingenuous, I guess is the best way to put it, in how they've tried to sell it and how they've tried to put together sections of it and everything. But why isn't our government explaining it to people and what their benefits can be in buying a license and holding on to it and then finding a company they can work with their license, and not having the government fund it, but let Americans fund it and Americans make the money on it?
Great.
A
So
$1,200 license, people have turned around and sold for $1 million. They know.
And I appreciate the question. We should have asked people to identify themselves, and I didn't ask you. I apologize.
Oh, I'm Janice Walt Grenadier.
Great. Welcome. So, David, you have the spectrum chart. I think you should be able to explain this to all of the American people, and we should just make that.
Gee, thanks, Brian. I would question that Americans don't know what spectrum is at this point. I sort of joke that when my grandparents started saying, my grandson works in spectrum policy, and that people knew what they meant, I started to figure out that people were starting to understand that spectrum is an important part of our economy, an important part of our communications ecosystem. As far as the ability for average Americans to be involved in purchasing licenses, we don't sell any. The Federal Communications Commission handles that. I wish Commissioner Carr were still here. I'm sure he could have a more fulsome conversation with you about how you could get your hands on licenses for various services. The vast majority of licenses at this point are auctioned, and they're auctioned as part of well-announced and advanced auctions that the FCC conducts, and many of Brad's member companies are participants in those auctions, and they spend billions of dollars and proceed to invest many multiples of that in building out the infrastructure. To the extent that there are people that are getting access to licenses and holding onto them and not using them, that's a problem the federal government has been trying to solve for decades. We don't want to see spectrum used inefficiently. The most efficient use of spectrum is to get it out there into the hands of people who are going to invest and who are going to make sure that when we put a commercial license out in the marketplace, it's being used to provide services. And that's what thousands of licensees in this country do, whether they be broadcasters or wireless providers or companies that are providing dispatch services over land mobile radio. So I'm not sure how to help you better understand that. That's really more an FCC issue than one for NTIA. But I think it's important to note that there are thousands of average Americans who have gotten licenses but not sat on them and just sold them, but proceeded to use them for services.
I'm not saying sitting on them. I say basically give them the opportunity to set up the small businesses that you can then purchase them with, and then you can partner with these types of companies.
And I do want to open it up for some more questions, but I think it's two important points you make. One is the importance of doing due diligence before you invest with someone who's arguably offering you a spectrum investment opportunity, because there are many people out there who misrepresent what that is, and that's very important. The other thing, which David alluded to, is spectrum is available in many different shapes and sizes, right? Tomorrow you can go get a ham radio license, or you can get a site-based license, which does not cost you money.
True.
Or there are auctions that are not multi-billion-dollar auctions, but are smaller slices of spectrum that are more accessible to the average American. And there are bidding credits available for small businesses to participate in those auctions. Those bidding credits go up to $250 million-ish, to a fairly large number. And so there are some, and there's, at the FCC, there's an Office of Communications Business Opportunities, which is designed to help people look at opportunities to participate as a small business. So there's a few different tools out there, but before you go giving your money to a speculator, you want to make sure of what exactly you're getting your hands on, because that has been a big problem for the Commission. And there has been fraud actions brought by state attorney generals and the Department of Justice against people who have done exactly that.
Right.
So,
I understand it.
Additional question from the audience? All right, my quick exit question. What do you think is the one communications issue that most Americans are worried about? And then what's the one issue they actually should be worried about?
I'd be crazy not to pile on with net neutrality.
There you go.
That's the one that everyone is worried about.
Only 22 million people have heard
and shouldn't be. But I think the one that people aren't worried about and probably should be, and one that people don't really know as much about, are the challenges in international fora. We are in the middle of preparations for the Plenipotentiary Conference at the International Telecommunication Union, which, again, the vast majority of Americans have never heard of. But is the agency, it predates the UN, but is part of the UN, and helps coordinate telecommunication regulation between countries, and perhaps more importantly, their radio communications sector helps control satellite allocations and frequency coordination across the planet. It is one of the most important agencies you've never heard of, and one we spend a lot of time working with to make sure that American interests are not negatively impacted.
It's a great one on global leadership. Chip?
So, I think the question that most Americans should be worried about, because it will have the biggest, I think, largest impact for the future of the Internet, is the race to 5G. And if you look at where we are today, there are reports today that China is winning that race. We won, as was mentioned earlier, the race to 4G. Why is that so important? The next age of the Internet is going to be, instead of connecting billions of people, it'll be connecting exponential greater numbers of devices and things to the Internet. Artificial intelligence, virtual reality, augmented reality, all of that will be driven by 5G technologies. Whoever wins that race will win a number of different benefits, from global leadership, economic leadership, and I think set the standards for security and privacy. So all of the future of the trust and the growth and the innovation So the work that the Commission is doing right now and that Congress is doing and David is doing on spectrum and deployment issues to win the deployment of both fiber, fixed, and spectrum to get to a 5G competitive world where we don't have to argue about net neutrality because we have a truly competitive market is really the big issue, the big challenge.
Great. Michelle?
I agree with Chip.
Yet again.
No, but I think, so I agree, but I would frame the statement slightly differently. I'm not one to worry about races, mainly because I come in last always. But if we want to be a leader, if we want to set the standards, then it's highly important that we not isolate ourselves from the rest of the world and their communications sector. If they are no longer allowed to produce for us and we are only producing for ourselves, then that makes it highly likely that we will not be the leader and that we will not have a say at the table as to how things will be developed elsewhere. And as important as we are economically, we are becoming smaller relative to the rest of the world. So we need to keep that in mind, that we want to be developing this, but we want to be developing this in a global fashion.
And Brad, close us out.
In terms of what they should care about, I would combine the three. I think it really is, how do we participate in this global economy? How do we recognize the importance of winning this global race for everything we want? We don't want this innovation exported overseas. In terms of concern the average American has, I still think it's privacy. I think the last month in the city has reminded us that there are a lot of people that hold our data in ways that we don't always know, and there should be a common set of rules and a common understanding of what's okay and what's not in one regulator. And I think anything the last month said that we can't get to that 5G place, we can't get to that connectivity if we all don't understand what data we're sharing and when we're sharing it and who has access to it. So I think the average American, they care a lot more about that than anything else we do.
Great. With that, I'd like to round of applause to thank our panel. Thank you guys for joining us. Great job.